Welcome to this webinar, Does My Child Have Dyslexia? My name is Dr. Alison DeMario. I'm an educational psychologist working for the Xavier Catholic Education Trust. This webinar is for parents who may be concerned about their child's progress in literacy, and you may be starting to consider whether there might be an underlying cause for that difficulty. This is a short session and it won't be able to answer that question for you, but it will give you information about literacy difficulties, dyslexia and diagnosis to help you to make an informed decision about the next steps in supporting your child. In this webinar, we will cover what is dyslexia, do I need to get a diagnosis, if I want one, how can I get a diagnosis for my child, what will the school do to support my child with their literacy difficulties, and finally, what can I do at home to help my child? So we're going to talk first about what literacy difficulties are. The first thing to say is that children's progress in literacy can be impacted by lots of factors. For example, their age within the year group, particularly when they're in the younger years, absences, whether they've had gaps in their learning due to COVID, for example, their exposure to books within the home or at school, their speech and language skills, their confidence and interest in reading, their attention span or motivation. All of those things can have a huge impact. We also know that difficulties with literacy often run in families, so seeing your child struggling might be particularly familiar or anxiety-provoking if you struggled yourself. The research shows us that children with literacy difficulties often have difficulties with their phonological skills, which refers to the ability to hear or distinguish sounds. This includes recognising sounds, adding sounds and taking apart sounds and moving sounds around. Children with literacy difficulties also often have difficulty holding information in their heads, which is also known sometimes as working memory. This is the skill that's needed when you ask your child to do 2 or 3 instructions, like can you go and brush your teeth, comb your hair and put your shoes on? And you find that actually they've only remembered to do one of those things. So working memory is really important for the development of literacy skills, because when we're sounding out longer words, we need to be able to remember all of those sounds together. When we're writing a sentence, we need to be able to remember which way around the letters go, how to spell those words. For the younger ones, it might be the finger spaces they still have to remember, and what we wanted the sentence to say, which can all be quite overwhelming if you find any of those individual skills difficult. Children with literacy difficulties also often need more time to process information that they have heard. But both this and working memory difficulties are just characteristics of some children with literacy difficulties, and they're not diagnostic criteria for something like dyslexia, for example, as many children who struggle with their literacy skills don't have issues with working memory and the speed of processing. So this brings us on to dyslexia. Some children with difficulties with reading and spelling are diagnosed with dyslexia. For lots of reasons, dyslexia has become quite a controversial and emotive term over the last few decades, with researchers, psychologists and many experts in the field really struggling to agree on exactly what dyslexia is. There have been many attempts at definitions, but due in part to the huge differences between individuals with dyslexia and the fact that they might all have different ways in which it presents for them, currently, most local authorities and researchers have adopted an understanding of dyslexia as just being a term that can be properly be used to describe children who experience problems learning to read and write. This definition means that the terms dyslexia and literacy difficulties are often used interchangeably in research and also in practice. So this leads us to the very important question of whether you need to get a dyslexia assessment or diagnosis for your child. Ultimately, the first thing to say is that whilst I'm here to present to you what the research tells us, and the most recent research tells us, you as a parent know what is best for your child. You may feel that having a diagnosis of dyslexia would allow them to better understand themselves. It may boost their confidence and self-esteem. You may even have had the experience yourself of diagnosis, or perhaps not being diagnosed, or having your needs recognised too late, in which case you may well feel that diagnosis is in the best interests of your child. On the other hand, there are some issues with diagnosis, which is where some of the controversy around dyslexia originates. As I said previously, there is no clear agreement on diagnostic criteria for dyslexia, other than that it's a difficulty with reading and or spelling. There are also no clear cut-offs in assessments that distinguish between those who struggle with literacy and then those who are dyslexic. And there aren't any specific diagnostic assessments. There are just ones that look at a variety of literacy skills and are then used to make a judgment. This all makes it incredibly difficult to be confident in making a diagnosis, which is why most educational psychologists in most local authorities no longer diagnose dyslexia. Finally, whilst labels can sometimes be really empowering, they can also sometimes have the opposite effect. And this is where, as a parent, your expertise in knowing your child are the most important, because you know which way it's more likely to go. However, some of the recent research looking at the Millennium Cohort by Knight 2021 showed that children who were labelled with dyslexia held lower beliefs about their ability in English and maths than peers who were matched for ability but didn't have the label of dyslexia. The children labelled with dyslexia were also significantly less likely to say that they would go to university. And furthermore, teachers and parents held lower aspirations for the children labelled with dyslexia. Having said that, that is just the research, and also we have to think about the anecdotal evidence of lots of young people and lots of adults who feel they've really benefited from having that diagnosis of dyslexia and having a label to put to their difficulties. So, of course, you may decide that you would like to get a diagnosis for your child and that that's in their best interests. These diagnoses, as I said before, because local authorities and educational psychologists do not tend to now make that diagnosis, it usually has to be done privately. You can find people who will do those assessments through the British Dyslexia Association. They have specialist assessors. However, they are very expensive, so there's usually a cost of between £400 to £600 for the assessment, the diagnosis and the report that they will give you. These assessments are carried out by professionals who are very skilled and very experienced in assessing pupils with literacy difficulties, and they look at a range of skills such as reading accuracy, fluency, comprehension, processing speed and working memory. And whilst these reports are, of course, very useful, most schools are also equipped with assessments or screeners that can provide some of this information. So whilst the school wouldn't be able to provide a diagnosis, it could be worth asking if they have assessments or screeners that could provide you with more understanding of your child's needs and exactly where their needs are within their literacy needs, which would of course be at no additional cost to you. So it's for all of these reasons that I stated previously that the stance within the Xavier Catholic Education Trust and also in most local authorities across the UK is as such. Firstly, that children need to be identified early if they have literacy difficulties, that we will be monitoring children from the earliest opportunities to be able to identify children who are finding things difficult, and we're putting support in place really early and not having to wait for them to fail before getting a diagnosis and then putting support in place. So we're getting things in place early. We need to look at each child as an individual and really understand their individual literacy needs, because dyslexia can mean so many different things. You might have a child who struggles to read but their spelling is okay, or their spelling is difficult for them but their reading is okay. They might have visual disturbances, they might not have visual disturbances, they might have working memory problems. You get my drift. So it's really important actually that we're looking at the individual child and what their needs are and putting that support in place for them. And finally, really importantly, all children who have literacy difficulties will be given the support they need, and this does not depend on a diagnosis. You may choose to get a diagnosis, and of course those reports are really helpful in being able to identify the specific needs that your child has, but the diagnosis in itself is not needed in order to get that support, and that's because otherwise this results and dyslexia generally is resulting in a huge social justice issue across the UK, where we cannot have a situation where children are only getting the support that they need if they're in a family where you can afford to get the diagnosis, and we cannot have that happening. So this relates not only to classroom support, but also to interventions and also exam concessions. So lots of people, lots of parents worry that their child won't get extra time in exams if they haven't got a diagnosis, but actually all of those things at both primary and secondary level, they're looked at on the basis of reading accuracy and fluency and comprehension and reading speed and processing speeds. They're looked at in terms of those individual needs, not on the basis of a diagnosis itself. And the necessary assessments, if there need to be assessments done, they can be done within school. So what support can you expect there to be available in schools? The support delivered in schools follows what's called a response to intervention model, which is shown in this diagram. And this means that children's progress is continually monitored and increasing support will be put in place should they need it. So the first part of the triangle at the top, the dark blue part, is the universal support for all children. And this includes all of the adjustments in the classroom that the teacher makes to ensure that your child is able to access the learning. And that, at that level, is enough to meet the needs of the vast majority of children. And I'll show you in a moment what that looks like. If these adjustments and support in the classroom, even with those, if your child is not making the expected amount of progress, the school may then offer Tier 2, which is the light blue part, and they'll be offered targeted support. And that refers to evidence-based interventions in small groups that are shown in the evidence to accelerate progress. And examples of those that you might hear of in your schools are things like the Literacy for All intervention, tracked literacy, and precision teaching. For a few children, it may be found that even with that extra targeted support, that's still not helping. And at that point, the SENCO will look closely at the interventions, look at how they can be adapted to make it more effective. They may bring outside agencies in at that point to support in making those adaptations. For example, they may decide to do an intervention individually rather than as part of a small group. So these are just some of the universal support strategies that teachers in your school use to support children with their literacy difficulties. These strategies focus not only on the reading and writing, but because the research tells us that children with literacy difficulties may sometimes have difficulties with working memory and information processing skills, these strategies also look at those things, as well as fine motor skills, their speech and language skills and the vocabulary, and their emotional skills, depending on what it is that your child needs. You may find it useful to pause these slides for a few moments just to look more closely at the support that's available as part of the universal offer for all children with literacy needs. So finally, we come on to what you can do to support your child at home. And of course, as parents, you play a huge role in supporting your children. You may have found that with the child struggling with their reading and writing all day at school, the last thing they want to do at home is read and write. So whilst continuing to encourage them to read, it's important that this doesn't become a stressful experience for you and your child. Luckily though, there are so many skills involved in literacy that don't involve physically reading and writing, and these might be a really good place to focus your support. So here are a few ideas and tips that you may find helpful. Firstly, the research shows that little and often is the best way to learn any new skill. So sometimes less is more, particularly if it means that they continue to enjoy reading. So if, for example, rather than asking your child to read the whole book, it might be that they read just the first 2 pages, or they read a page, you read a page, they read a page, you read a page. And that way they might continue to enjoy the experience and just do a little bit of it, and that is better than forcing them to do a whole lot that becomes overwhelming and stressful. Vocabulary has also been shown to be hugely important in developing reading skills, so continue to read to them even when they can read themselves, or encourage them to listen to audiobooks, because this will develop their vocabulary and also their comprehension skills, as they'll be able to really listen and understand the story without having the barrier of having to decode the words at a fluent enough speed to make sense of it. You can support their comprehension skills further by asking them questions about what you are reading to them or what they're reading. So some good questions to ask might be encouraging them to predict what they think will happen next in the story, asking them to summarise or retell chunks of the story, or answer questions about how they think the characters might be feeling. Another thing you can use is a tool called story cubes that you can buy quite cheaply on Amazon to encourage them to create stories aloud. So this will help with their story composition and their vocabulary without having to put pen to paper at all, and hopefully they'll also find that quite fun. Putting subtitles on the TV can be helpful because it exposes them to the text without them having to. It can expose them to the text that's being spoken to them without, and they might actually find themselves reading along without realising. Try to keep reading fun by finding opportunities to read that doesn't necessarily involve reading a book. So for example, that might be magazines, recipes, it might be in board games, it might be on computer games. And whilst they might have set books from school that are important for them to read because they're at their level, some children will also feel more motivated to read books of their own choosing, particularly when they're getting older and they may feel that the books that they're being given that are at their reading level are below their chronological age and their interests. So this should certainly be encouraged, as they'll be able to access some words that they're familiar with, but they'll also feel more motivated to read and access a wider vocabulary than they might get through the books that are at their actual reading level. There's also lots of research to support the effectiveness of reading to dogs, which might sound a bit strange, but this is related to the child feeling really relaxed in the presence of an animal and being able to read freely without fear of judgment or correction. Obviously, you may not have access to a dog, and if you don't, these same principles could be applied to any pet, it could be applied to younger children, or even just reading to their favourite toy. There are also lots of apps for reading that children may enjoy using, or they may feel more motivated to read from an iPad, for example, accessing their reading scheme books through Oxford Owl. And if your child's taking part in a targeted intervention, like the ones that we spoke about before, it may be that you could support the effectiveness of that intervention by practicing some of the words that they're learning in the intervention at home. And finally, paired reading is a lovely strategy for reading with children to develop their accuracy, fluency and confidence. Rather than explain that on here, there is a lovely video that's been developed by Surrey Learning and Language Support that explains how to use paired reading, and I've put the link for that video in the comments below. So in summary, I hope that you feel reassured that there is a lot of support available in your schools to support your child with their literacy difficulties, so please do speak with your child's class teacher or SENCO if you have any concerns at all, because the support always works best when the parents and schools are working together. And finally, please feel reassured that whilst you may want to seek a diagnosis for your child, if you don't have one, it won't be a barrier to your child being able to access the support that they need within Xavier schools. And lastly, here are the references that I referred to earlier if you wanted to do any further reading around this area, because it is a real complex area and it's a bit of a minefield really. So there are some really good references that are recent research to have a little look at and really make an informed decision for yourself. So I hope that this session has been helpful, and thank you very much for listening.